James Thornton lounged on a leather sofa in the corner of his penthouse apartment, a glass of scotch dangling from his hand. He wasn't concerned about the scandal plastered across the news. Headlines screamed his name: Playboy billionaire James Thornton's wild night sparks chaos. Let them talk, he muttered, raising his glass in a mock toast to the city skyline. His father, Charles Thornton, stormed into the room without knocking. The older man's presence was a force of nature, as sharp as his tailored suit. His piercing gray eyes scanned the opulent room, landing on James. "Turn that garbage off," Charles barked, nodding toward the television replaying James's latest escapade. James smirked but muted the screen. "You know, Dad, for a man worth billions, you sure spend a lot of time worrying about what other people think." "This isn't about what they think, it's about what this family represents," Charles snapped, his voice like gravel. "Do you have any idea how much damage you've done to our reputation?" James shrugged, unbothered. "Relax. People forget scandals in days. Next week, it'll be someone else's turn." Charles wasn't buying it. He pulled out a folder and slapped it onto the marble coffee table. Inside were photos of James stumbling out of a nightclub, surrounded by chaos. There were lawsuits, angry letters from shareholders, and one particularly scathing email from a longtime business associate. "I've had enough," Charles said, his tone dangerously calm. "You have no direction, no discipline, and no respect for what it took to build this legacy." James rolled his eyes. "Here we go again. The speech about how you came from nothing, worked your way up. You think this is funny?" Charles interrupted, leaning forward. "If I didn't step in to clean up after you, you'd be buried in lawsuits by now. I'm done. It's time you learn what it means to earn your place in this world." James sat up, his smirk fading. "What's that supposed to mean?" Charles crossed his arms, his expression unyielding. "You're going to marry someone I've chosen." James blinked, stunned into silence. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Her name is Ellie Carter. She's a farmer, works hard, values integrity. Everything you lack." "A farmer?" James scoffed, leaning back in disbelief. "What, you think marrying some country girl is going to magically turn me into a saint?" "I think it'll force you to face the kind of life you've always looked down on," Charles retorted. "She agreed because her family needs help, and you'll stay with her for 6 months. No loopholes, no escape. If you refuse, you're out. No money, no inheritance. Nothing." James stared at his father, searching for a hint of bluff, but Charles was dead serious. "This is insane," James muttered. "You can't control my life like this." "You've left me no choice," Charles replied. "The world doesn't revolve around you, James. It's time you learn that." James's mind raced. 6 months married to a farmer? He could barely handle a week without luxury. But losing his inheritance? The thought sent a chill through him. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll do it. But don't expect me to enjoy it." Charles gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "You leave for Kansas tomorrow. Pack light, you won't need much where you're going." James watched his father walk out, the finality of the moment sinking in. For the first time in his life, he couldn't buy his way out of trouble. And for the first time, he wondered if he was truly in over his head. The following afternoon, James Thornton stepped off a bus onto a dirt road surrounded by fields stretching endlessly into the horizon. A lone farmhouse sat in the distance, weathered but sturdy, with a red barn standing like a sentinel beside it. James grimaced, adjusting his designer sunglasses against the unrelenting sun. "This must be a joke," he muttered under his breath, dragging his luggage, a sleek leather suitcase that looked absurdly out of place on the dusty ground. A petite woman approached from the barn, wiping her hands on a worn denim apron. Her auburn hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, and her boots were caked in mud. She stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms and looking James up and down. "You must be James," she said flatly. "And you must be Ellie." He forced a smile, trying to mask his unease. "Charmed, I'm sure." Ellie didn't return the sentiment. Her green eyes narrowed as she gestured toward his luggage. "What's in there?" "A week's worth of suits. You'll find they're not much use here." James bristled. "Not everyone can live in flannel and boots, sweetheart." Her lips twitched as though she was fighting back a laugh. "This isn't a vacation. You're here to work. Let's see if you last a week." "Work?" James echoed, incredulous. "I'm not some farmhand." Ellie turned on her heel, already walking toward the house. "You are now." Reluctantly, James followed her. The inside of the farmhouse was clean but modest, with well-worn furniture and faded curtains. It smelled faintly of lavender and soil, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of his penthouse. "This is your room." Ellie opened a door to a small guest room containing a twin bed, a wooden dresser, and little else. "Bathrooms down the hall. Breakfast is at 6. Don't be late." 6 in the morning? James groaned. "Is that even legal?" Ellie didn't dignify the comment with a response. Instead, she disappeared into the kitchen, leaving James alone to unpack. He looked around the room in dismay. The mattress was lumpy, the window stuck, and there wasn't a single luxury item in sight. "This is going to be torture," he muttered, throwing his suitcase onto the bed. The next morning, James discovered just how literal that sentiment was. At exactly 6 a.m., Ellie banged on his door. "You're late," she called, her voice sharp enough to cut through his groggy haze. James stumbled out of bed and into the kitchen, where Ellie was already frying eggs and brewing coffee. "I didn't know farmers kept military hours," he grumbled, plopping into a chair. Ellie slid a plate in front of him. "Eat fast. You've got work to do." "Work? Already?" James raised an eyebrow. "I just got here." Ellie didn't respond, instead handing him a pair of gloves and leading him outside. The farm was alive with activity, chickens clucked, cows mooed, and the fields seemed to hum in the early morning sun. "First lesson," Ellie announced, gesturing toward a wheelbarrow full of hay. "Feed the cows. Think you can handle that?" James looked at the wheelbarrow, then at the massive creatures standing in the nearby pen. They're not going to, charge or anything, right?" Ellie sighed, clearly unimpressed. "They're cows, not bulls. Just get in there and dump the hay." Reluctantly, James rolled the wheelbarrow toward the pen. The cows stared at him as he entered, their eyes eerily calm but intimidating nonetheless. He dumped the hay and quickly retreated, wiping his hands on his jeans. "See?" Ellie said with a smirk. "Not so hard." James shot her a glare. "This isn't exactly my skill set." "It will be." She handed him a rake. Next up, cleaning the stalls. By midday, James was drenched in sweat and covered in dirt. His arms ached from raking, and his legs felt like jelly after hauling water buckets to the fields. Ellie, meanwhile, worked tirelessly beside him, barely breaking a sweat. "How do you do this every day?" James panted, leaning against a fence post. "You get used to it," Ellie said simply, tossing him a bottle of water. "And you stop complaining." James took a long drink, watching her as she wiped her brow and surveyed the fields. For the first time, he noticed the quiet strength in her demeanor. There was no pretense, no need for approval, just a woman determined to protect what mattered to her. "You don't think this whole marriage thing is weird?" James asked, breaking the silence. Ellie shrugged. "We're both stuck with it, so why dwell on it? Besides, I need the money your father promised to save the farm." "Ah, so you're using me too," James said with a faint smirk. Ellie shot him a look. "Difference is, I'm not pretending this is anything more than a deal." James frowned but didn't argue. He couldn't quite place it, but something about Ellie's blunt honesty was unsettling. Unlike the socialites he was used to, she didn't care who he was or what he had. She cared about her farm, her family's legacy, and little else. That evening, James collapsed onto the lumpy mattress, utterly spent. Every muscle in his body ached, and his designer clothes were stained beyond repair. He stared at the ceiling, wondering how he was going to survive even 1 week, let alone 6 months. Outside, the crickets chirped, and the stars were brighter than he'd ever seen in the city. For the first time in years, James felt truly alone, not just physically, but emotionally. He thought about his father's ultimatum and the strange woman he was now tied to. "This isn't my world," he whispered to himself. "But it's hers." As exhaustion overtook him, James couldn't shake the feeling that this farm, and Ellie, were going to change him in ways he couldn't yet understand. The next few days unfolded in a frustrating rhythm for James Thornton. Every morning, Ellie was up before the sun, and every morning, she dragged James along for chores that seemed both endless and impossible. Whether it was repairing fences, herding livestock, or hauling supplies, James always seemed to find a way to mess things up. On the third morning, Ellie found him trying, and failing, to mend a broken chicken coop. "What are you doing?" she asked, watching as James struggled to hammer a nail into a warped plank. "I'm attempting to fix this death trap," he muttered, wincing as the hammer slipped from his grip. "These chickens deserve better." Ellie sighed, taking the hammer from him. "You're not holding it right. Watch." With quick, practiced movements, she secured the plank in place, then handed the hammer back. "Now try." James mimicked her actions, managing to secure the next nail without catastrophe. "Guess I'm learning," he said with a sheepish grin. Ellie gave him a faint smile. "Slowly. But don't expect a gold star just yet." Despite the gradual improvements, tensions between them continued to simmer. James's sarcastic remarks and occasional blunders clashed with Ellie's no-nonsense attitude, creating frequent arguments. One afternoon, as they worked side by side stacking hay bales, James finally lost his temper. "Do you ever let up?" he snapped, dropping the bale he was carrying. "It's like you're determined to make this as miserable as possible for me." Ellie stopped mid-motion, her gaze cold. "Miserable? You think this is miserable? Try growing up knowing every meal depends on what you can grow or raise. Try working 12-hour days just to keep your family's land. You've had everything handed to you, James. Don't talk to me about miserable." The words stung more than James expected. He opened his mouth to retort but stopped, noticing the way Ellie's hands trembled slightly as she picked up another bale. He realized her frustration wasn't just with him, it was with the weight she carried every day. "Look," he said after a long pause. "I'm trying, okay? This isn't my world, but I'm not here to make it harder for you." Ellie glanced at him, her expression softening for a moment before she turned away. "Then stop whining and start working." That evening, James sat alone on the front porch, staring out at the horizon as the sun dipped below the fields. The day's events replayed in his mind, and for the first time, he wondered what it would be like to walk in Ellie's shoes, to shoulder the responsibility of an entire farm, alone. Lost in thought, he didn't notice Ellie join him until she spoke. "What are you thinking about?" James glanced at her, startled. "Just how different this place is from the city. It's quieter. Simpler." "Yeah," Ellie said, leaning against the railing. "But simple doesn't mean easy." James nodded, his usual bravado absent. "I guess I never really understood what it means to work for something." Ellie studied him for a moment before nodding toward the barn. "Tomorrow, we're repairing the irrigation system. Be ready." "Can't wait," James said with a dry chuckle. But as Ellie walked back inside, he couldn't help but feel a small flicker of pride. He might still be out of his depth, but he was starting to care about the farm, the work, and, to his surprise, Ellie. The next morning, James was up before Ellie, waiting at the kitchen table with coffee already brewed. She raised an eyebrow as she walked in. "What's this? Are you finally taking this seriously?" "Don't get used to it," James said, though his tone was lighter than usual. "But I figured I'd save you the trouble of dragging me out of bed." Ellie smirked, grabbing a mug. "Let's see if that attitude holds up when we're knee-deep in mud." Over the next few days, James found himself gradually settling into the rhythm of farm life. It wasn't easy, and he still stumbled more often than not, but he was learning. Ellie, too, seemed to soften, offering him small words of encouragement when he got something right. However, the growing camaraderie was short-lived. One afternoon, as James returned from a supply run, he spotted a black car parked outside the farmhouse. His stomach sank when he recognized the man leaning against it, Gregory, one of his father's employees. "What are you doing here?" James demanded, approaching the car. Gregory adjusted his sunglasses, his expression impassive. "Just checking in, per your father's request. He wanted to ensure you're holding up your end of the deal." "I don't need a babysitter," James snapped. "Tell him I'm fine." Gregory's gaze shifted to the barn, where Ellie was working. "She seems capable. Makes me wonder how much she knows about the arrangement." "None of your business," James said through gritted teeth. "Just leave." Gregory raised his hands in mock surrender. "Suit yourself." "But I'd be careful, James. People like her don't usually mix well with people like us." James watched as Gregory drove away, unease churning in his gut. The last thing he needed was his father interfering, or Ellie finding out the full extent of the deal. That night, the tension weighed heavily on James as he helped Ellie prepare dinner. She noticed his distraction but didn't press until they were seated at the table. "What's going on with you?" she asked, slicing into her steak. "You've been off since you got back." "Nothing," James said quickly, avoiding her gaze. "Just tired." Ellie frowned but didn't push further. Still, James couldn't shake the feeling that the fragile peace they'd built was in danger of shattering. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, James realized he was facing a choice: continue pretending, or be honest with Ellie about the deal with his father. Either way, the consequences would be unavoidable. James stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his shirt for what felt like the 100th time. Ellie had insisted he wear something casual but presentable, which apparently meant no designer labels. He felt ridiculous in the simple button-up shirt and jeans she'd picked for him, but arguing had gotten him nowhere. "Are you planning to spend all day in there?" Ellie called from the hallway, her voice carrying a note of impatience. With a sigh, James stepped out of his room. Ellie stood at the bottom of the staircase, her hair loosely braided and wearing a sundress that swayed slightly as she moved. For a moment, James was struck by how different she looked outside of her usual work attire, softer, almost ethereal. "What?" she asked, noticing his stare. "Nothing," James said quickly, clearing his throat. "So, what exactly is this festival?" Ellie rolled her eyes but smiled faintly. "It's just a small-town thing. Music, food, a little dancing. It's one of the few chances people around here have to relax." "Sounds quaint," James replied, though his tone lacked its usual sarcasm. The town square was already bustling when they arrived. Strings of fairy lights crisscrossed between wooden poles, and the scent of barbecue filled the air. Booths lined the perimeter, selling everything from handmade crafts to jars of honey. A stage had been set up at one end, where a local band played an upbeat tune. James followed Ellie through the crowd, feeling out of place but oddly intrigued. He caught snippets of conversation as they walked, neighbors greeting one another, laughter over shared stories. It was a far cry from the high society galas he was used to, but there was an authenticity to it that he couldn't deny. "Ellie," a voice called out, and a woman with graying hair rushed over, pulling Ellie into a hug. "It's so good to see you." "And who's this?" "This is James," Ellie said, gesturing toward him. He's helping out on the farm." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but extended her hand. "Nice to meet you, James. I'm Margaret. Ellie's told me so much about you." "All good things, I hope," James replied, shaking her hand. Margaret chuckled. "We'll see. You don't look like the farmhand type." Ellie smirked. "He's still learning." James glanced at Ellie, catching the hint of teasing in her tone, and found himself smiling despite himself. As the evening wore on, James began to relax. He tried fried dough for the first time, joined a ring toss game, and failed miserably, and even helped Ellie set up a table for the local farmers' cooperative. Despite his initial resistance, he couldn't deny the charm of the festival or the warmth of the people. At one point, Ellie pulled him toward the dance floor. "Come on," she said, grabbing his hand. "I don't dance," James protested, trying to dig his heels in. "Neither do half the people here," Ellie said, laughing as she tugged him forward. "But that's not the point." Reluctantly, James followed her lead. The band played a lively tune, and Ellie swayed easily to the rhythm. James, on the other hand, was stiff and awkward, stepping on her toes more than once. "You're hopeless," Ellie said, laughing as she tried to guide him. "Hey, I'm better with champagne in hand," James retorted, but he was grinning. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't thinking about his father's expectations or the deal that had brought him here. He was just present. Later, as the festival began to wind down, James and Ellie found themselves sitting on a bench at the edge of the square, watching the last of the children chase each other around the emptying booths. "Do you come to this every year?" James asked. "Almost every year," Ellie replied, her voice softer now. "It's a nice reminder of what this community is about. Everyone here looks out for each other." James nodded, his gaze drifting to the stage where the band was packing up. "I can see why you care about this place so much." Ellie glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "It's not perfect, but it's home." James leaned back, his hands resting on the bench. "I've been to a lot of places, New York, Paris, Dubai. But none of them ever felt like home." Ellie studied him for a moment. "Maybe you weren't looking for the right things." James turned to her, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was something unspoken between them, a fragile connection that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. As they walked back to the car, Ellie broke the silence. "You did good tonight." James raised an eyebrow. "Good? I think I was incredible." Ellie rolled her eyes but smiled. "Let's not get carried away. But it was nice to see you actually enjoying yourself." "Yeah," James admitted, surprising himself. It was. For the first time since he'd arrived at the farm, he felt like he belonged, if only for a fleeting moment. That night, as James lay in bed, he replayed the evening in his mind. The laughter, the music, the easy way Ellie had smiled at him. He didn't want to admit it, but something about her was starting to break through the walls he'd spent years building. But then he thought of Gregory's visit, the deal with his father, and the reality of their arrangement. Whatever connection he felt, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. They were playing roles, and sooner or later, the truth would come out. With a sigh, James turned onto his side, staring at the shadows on the wall. For now, he'd let himself enjoy the small victories. Tomorrow, the farm awaited, and so did Ellie. The morning sun bathed the farm in golden light as James trudged toward the barn. Despite his growing familiarity with the routine, farm life still left him exhausted by the end of each day. But something had shifted. He was no longer counting the days until he could leave. Instead, he found himself invested, albeit reluctantly, in the farm's success. Ellie was already at work when James arrived. She stood on a ladder, repairing the roof of the chicken coop. "You're late," she called without looking down. James grinned, a playful retort ready, but the words died on his lips as he noticed the tightness in her movements. She was favoring her right leg, her balance precarious. "Ellie, hold on." He approached quickly. "You're going to fall." "I'm fine," she said dismissively, though her knuckles were white as she gripped the ladder. "You look like you're about to topple over." Before she could argue, James steadied the ladder with both hands. "At least let me help." Ellie sighed but relented, climbing down. "It's just a sprain. I twisted my ankle last week moving feed." James frowned. "Why didn't you say anything?" Ellie shrugged. "Because there's no one else to do the work." Her words lingered as James took over, hammering the loose shingles into place. He realized how much Ellie shouldered alone, her stubborn determination keeping her going even when it clearly took a toll. Later that afternoon, James was hauling hay bales when a small notebook fell from a pile and landed at his feet. Curious, he picked it up, flipping through its pages. The handwriting was neat but faded, and the words painted a vivid picture of life on the farm. The notebook wasn't Ellie's, it belonged to her late mother. Entries described the family's struggles to keep the farm afloat, as well as dreams of expanding it into a thriving community hub. One passage, dated years ago, caught James's attention. "This land is more than a home. It's a legacy, a promise to those who came before us and those who will come after. I only hope Ellie understands that when the time comes." James stared at the words, feeling an unexpected pang in his chest. He understood now why Ellie fought so hard for the farm. It wasn't just about survival. It was about honoring the past and preserving a future. He looked up as Ellie entered the barn, her face flushed from the heat. "You okay?" she asked, noticing his pensive expression. "Yeah," James said quickly, tucking the notebook behind his back. "I just needed a break." Ellie smirked. "City boy needs a break already? Shocking." James forced a laugh but couldn't shake the heaviness in his chest. He slipped the notebook into his pocket, determined to return it later without Ellie knowing. That evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, James couldn't resist bringing up what he'd read. "Your mom, she must have been amazing," he said carefully. Ellie's expression softened. "She was. She taught me everything I know about this place." "Did she always want you to take over the farm?" Ellie nodded, her gaze distant. "She did, but she never forced it. She just believed in this place, in what it could be." James hesitated, then said, "And what about you? Do you believe in it?" Ellie looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his question. "I don't know if I believe in the farm itself," she admitted. "But I believe in what it represents. It's not just land, it's history, family, and community. Losing it would mean losing all of that." Her words struck a chord James couldn't quite identify. For years, he'd drifted through life, chasing shallow thrills without ever finding something worth holding onto. Ellie's connection to the farm, her unwavering sense of purpose, was something he'd never experienced. The next morning, James returned the notebook to its place in the barn, careful not to let Ellie see. But her words stayed with him as he worked alongside her, slowly finding satisfaction in tasks that once seemed meaningless. That afternoon, they tackled the irrigation system, a daunting task involving heavy pipes and muddy trenches. Despite the grueling work, James found himself joking with Ellie, their banter easing the tension that often lingered between them. "You're not completely hopeless, you know," Ellie said as they finished, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I'll take that as a compliment," James replied with a smirk. "Coming from you, it might be the highest praise I'll ever get." Ellie laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that took James by surprise. For a moment, the weight of the deal with his father, the pressure to prove himself, and the uncertainty of the future faded away. But the peace was short-lived. That evening, as James was closing up the barn, he noticed a black SUV parked on the far edge of the property. His stomach tightened as Gregory stepped out, a smug smile on his face. "Evening, Mr. Thornton," Gregory said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Thought I'd drop by and see how you're faring." "What do you want?" James asked, his voice cold. Gregory shrugged, glancing toward the farmhouse. "Just doing my job." "Your father likes to stay informed." "Well, you can inform him that I'm doing fine," James said sharply. "Now leave." Gregory didn't move. "You're getting comfortable here, aren't you? But don't forget why you're really here. This isn't your world, James, and it never will be." James clenched his fists, but before he could respond, Gregory got back into his car and drove away. The encounter left James seething, his earlier contentment replaced by a gnawing unease. As he walked back to the house, he glanced at the faint glow of the kitchen light, where Ellie was tidying up after dinner. She had no idea about the arrangement with his father, and James couldn't shake the feeling that the truth would shatter whatever fragile trust they'd built. That night, as James lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about Ellie's struggles, her dreams, and her resilience. She deserved more than a half-hearted effort from him. For the first time, James wasn't just going through the motions, he wanted to help, not because of his father's ultimatum, but because Ellie deserved to win the fight for her home. But even as his resolve strengthened, so did the weight of the secrets he carried. For all his progress, James knew that the truth was a storm waiting to break. The sun was dipping low on the horizon as James dragged himself into the barn after a long day of repairs. He'd spent hours helping Ellie fix a broken fence, and though his body was aching, he felt an unfamiliar sense of accomplishment. The farm was starting to feel less like a punishment and more like something he could care about. That fragile contentment shattered when he heard Ellie's voice rise outside the barn. "What do you mean it's his company?" Ellie's tone was sharp, laced with disbelief and anger. James froze, his heart sinking. He stepped out into the fading light and saw Ellie standing near the farmhouse, clutching a letter. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she held the paper up to him. "You knew about this," she demanded, her voice shaking. "What are you talking about?" James asked cautiously, approaching her. Ellie thrust the letter at him. "It's from the bank. They're selling my debt to a private investor. And guess who's behind it? Thornton Enterprises. Your father." James stared at the letter, his mind racing. He hadn't known this specific detail, but it didn't surprise him. His father had a way of controlling situations, always pulling the strings from behind the scenes. "I didn't know," James said quickly, his voice earnest. "Ellie, I swear I had no idea." Her eyes narrowed. "But you knew there was something, didn't you? You've been hiding things from me this whole time." James hesitated. "It's not like that. I didn't want to make things worse." Ellie let out a bitter laugh. "Worse? You've been lying to me, James. This whole thing, it's all just some game to you and your father, isn't it? Stringing me along while he swoops in to take everything." "It's not a game," James said, his voice rising. "I didn't ask for this, okay? I didn't want to be here, but I stayed because I started to care." "Care?" Ellie repeated, her tone cutting. "You don't care, James. You don't know the first thing about what it means to care about something, really care." The words hit James like a slap, but before he could respond, Ellie turned and stormed toward the house. He followed, desperate to explain, but she spun around, her eyes blazing. "Don't. Just don't." Her voice cracked, and James could see the hurt she was trying to hide. "I thought maybe you were different. But you're just like him." She walked inside, slamming the door behind her. James stood there in the silence, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He'd seen Ellie angry before, but this was something else: betrayal, disappointment, and heartbreak all rolled into one. That night, James couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, staring out at the fields that stretched endlessly under the moonlight. For weeks, he'd been trying to prove himself, to Ellie, to his father, and maybe even to himself. But now it felt like all his efforts had been for nothing. The next morning, Ellie was distant. She went about her tasks as if James didn't exist, her usual remarks replaced by cold silence. James tried to help, but she brushed him off at every turn. "Ellie," he said finally, catching her by the barn. "We need to talk." "No, we don't," she replied, not even looking at him. "Just stay out of my way." James ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "You can't just shut me out like this." Ellie stopped, turning to face him with a glare. "Why not? You've been shutting me out since the day you got here. Only difference is, I trusted you. That's on me." "Ellie, please," James said, his voice breaking. "I'm not my father. I'm trying to help you." She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't need your help, James. I needed honesty. And you couldn't even give me that." James watched helplessly as she walked away, disappearing into the house. He felt a hollowness he couldn't quite name, like he'd lost something he hadn't even realized he wanted. Determined to make things right, James called his father that afternoon. Charles's voice was as clipped and authoritative as ever when he answered. "James," he said. To what do I owe the pleasure? You need to back off, James said without preamble. Leave Ellie's farm alone. Charles chuckled, the sound cold and dismissive. I see you've gotten attached. I warned you about that. This isn't about me, James said, his anger rising. It's about her. She's worked her entire life to keep this place going, and you're trying to take it away from her. Business is business, Charles replied. If her farm can't survive, that's not my concern. It should be, James shot back. Because this isn't just a farm, it's her life, her family's legacy. And you're destroying it. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Charles spoke again, his tone colder than before. You're forgetting your place, James. This deal isn't about her, it's about you learning to grow up. And I have, James said firmly. Which is why I'm telling you to stop. If you don't, I'll find another way to save her farm. With or without you. Charles sighed, his patience clearly wearing thin. You're making a mistake, son. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. No, James said, his voice steady. You've spent your whole life letting greed cloud yours. He hung up before his father could respond, his heart pounding. It was the first time he'd ever truly stood up to Charles, and though he felt a rush of pride, he also knew the fight was far from over. That evening, James found Ellie by the fields, her silhouette outlined by the setting sun. He approached cautiously, unsure if she'd even listen to him. I talked to my father, he said, his voice quiet. I told him to back off. Ellie didn't look at him. And what did he say? That he wouldn't. But I'm not giving up, James said firmly. I'm going to help you, Ellie. Not because of him, not because of any deal, but because you deserve better. She turned then, her expression guarded. I don't need saving, James. I know, he said. But that doesn't mean you have to do it alone. For a moment, Ellie said nothing, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. Finally, she nodded, her voice soft. You've got a lot to prove. I know, James said, his resolve strengthening. And I will. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they stood together in silence, the unspoken tension between them easing just enough to leave room for hope. The next morning, James woke with a renewed sense of purpose. His conversation with Ellie the night before had ignited something in him, a determination to take action, not just for her but for himself. He had spent years coasting on privilege, avoiding responsibility. But now, standing by Ellie's side, he was ready to fight. When he found Ellie in the kitchen, she was already preparing for another long day of work. She glanced at him briefly but said nothing, her walls still up. James decided to focus on actions instead of words. I've got some ideas, he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Ellie raised an eyebrow but didn't stop slicing bread. Ideas for what? For how we can save the farm, James replied. Your debts, the land, everything. Ellie froze mid-slice, finally meeting his gaze. And how exactly do you plan to do that? James took a deep breath. We're going to rally the town. The people at the festival, they care about you, about this place. If we can get their support, we might be able to buy more time. Ellie let out a dry laugh. James, this isn't a bake sale. We need real money, not goodwill. I know, James said, refusing to be deterred. But what if we turn goodwill into something tangible? A fundraiser, maybe. An event that brings the community together and raises enough to show the bank you're serious. Ellie hesitated, her skepticism evident. And you think people will actually show up? They will, James said confidently. You've spent your life helping them. Now it's their turn to help you. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning. James, to Ellie's surprise, threw himself into the effort with a focus and drive she hadn't seen before. He spoke to local businesses, pitched the idea to townsfolk, and even convinced the mayor to lend the town square for the event. Who are you, and what have you done with James Thornton? Ellie joked one evening as they worked on posters at the kitchen table. James smirked. What can I say? Turns out I'm a natural. Ellie shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She still had her doubts, but she couldn't deny the impact James was having. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. The day of the fundraiser arrived with clear skies and a buzz of energy in the air. The town square had been transformed, with booths set up for food, crafts, and games. A stage had been built for live music, and a banner reading "Save Ellie's Farm" stretched across the entrance. James stood by the stage, directing volunteers and ensuring everything ran smoothly. Ellie approached, her usual guarded expression replaced by one of cautious optimism. "This is impressive," she admitted, glancing around. "Don't sound so surprised," James replied, grinning. "I told you we'd pull it off." As people began to arrive, Ellie's disbelief grew. Families, business owners, and even strangers came together, contributing money, buying goods, and sharing stories about how Ellie and her farm had impacted their lives. James stayed busy, working the crowd and rallying support. He even charmed the local news crew into covering the event, ensuring their story reached a wider audience. Watching him in action, Ellie couldn't help but feel a newfound respect for him. As the sun set and the band took the stage, James found Ellie sitting by one of the booths, looking out at the lively scene. He joined her, handing her a soda. "You've been quiet," he said. Ellie took a sip, her gaze still on the crowd. "I'm just overwhelmed. I never thought so many people cared." "They care because of you," James said. "Because of everything you've done for this town." Ellie glanced at him, her expression softening. "And because of you. I couldn't have done this alone." James shook his head. "You gave me a reason to try. That's all you." Ellie smiled, and for a moment, the tension between them melted away. They sat in silence, watching the band play as the town came together around them. As the event wound down, James tallied the donations with Ellie and a few volunteers. The final total left Ellie speechless. This might actually work," she said, her voice trembling. "It's enough to pay off the immediate debt," James said, "and show the bank you're serious about keeping the farm." Ellie looked at him, tears shining in her eyes. "I don't even know what to say." "Say you'll stop doubting me," James replied with a grin. Ellie laughed, wiping her eyes. "I'll think about it." But their victory was short-lived. As the last few guests trickled out, a sleek black car pulled up to the square. Charles Thornton stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he approached. "Quite the spectacle," Charles said, his tone cool. "You've certainly learned how to work a crowd." James stood, stepping in front of Ellie. "What are you doing here?" Charles ignored him, his gaze sweeping over the donation boxes. "Impressive effort, but you're only delaying the inevitable. Thornton Enterprises will have this land soon enough." Ellie stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fire in her eyes. "Over my dead body." Charles smirked. "You're fighting a losing battle, Miss Carter. Business is about power, not sentiment." "Then it's a good thing this isn't your business," James said, his voice sharp. "It's hers." Charles raised an eyebrow, his expression hardening. "You're throwing away everything I've given you for this?" "For her?" James didn't hesitate. "No. I'm throwing away everything you've taken for granted. You've spent your life chasing profits, but you don't understand what it means to actually build something." Charles's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Ellie spoke up. "This farm isn't just land. It's my family's history. And we're not going anywhere." The determination in her voice seemed to take Charles aback. He studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "We'll see." He turned and walked away, leaving James and Ellie standing together under the dim glow of the streetlights. As they packed up the remaining supplies, Ellie glanced at James. "I don't know what's going to happen next, but thank you for everything." James smiled, exhaustion and relief evident in his expression. "We're not done yet. But we'll figure it out. Together." Ellie nodded, and for the first time, James felt like they were truly on the same team. James sat at the edge of the farmhouse porch, the morning light casting long shadows over the fields. A soft breeze carried the scent of freshly tilled soil, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were a whirlwind, circling back to the confrontation with his father the night before. Charles Thornton had left without another word, but James knew the man well enough to know he wouldn't back down easily. Ellie emerged from the house, her steps hesitant. "You've been out here a while." James glanced up, offering her a faint smile. "Just thinking." "About him?" Ellie asked, sitting beside him. James nodded. "My father doesn't lose. At least, not without a fight." Ellie studied him, her green eyes searching his face. "Are you sure about this? Going against him, it's not just about me. It's about you standing up to everything he's built." James took a deep breath, his jaw tightening. "That's exactly why I have to do it. He's been controlling my life for too long. This farm, this fight, it's not just about you or the land anymore. It's about proving that he doesn't own me." Ellie's lips curved into a small smile. "You've come a long way, James Thornton." James chuckled softly. "Let's hope it's far enough." Later that day, James made the call he'd been dreading. The line clicked, and his father's voice came through, cool and composed as always. "James. I was wondering when I'd hear from you." "We need to talk," James said, his tone firm. "I thought we said all there was to say last night," Charles replied, his voice laced with condescension. "No," James countered, "you talked, and I listened. But now it's my turn." There was a pause on the line before Charles said, "Go on." James stood, pacing the length of the porch as he spoke. "I'm not letting you take Ellie's farm. Not because of some power play or business deal. If you go through with this, you'll lose me. For good." Charles let out a sharp laugh. "Don't be dramatic, James. You're my son. You'll come back." "No, I won't," James said, his voice unwavering. "You think I'm bluffing? Try me. You might own a billion-dollar empire, but you don't own me." Charles's tone shifted, cold and cutting. "You've always been naive, James. You think sentiment will save that farm? Business doesn't work that way." "This isn't just business," James snapped. "It's about people. Ellie, her family, this town, they've given me something you never could. A reason to care." Another long silence. When Charles finally spoke, his voice was quiet but edged with steel. "If you walk away from me, James, there's no coming back. No inheritance, no safety net. You'll be on your own." "I know," James said, his heart pounding. "And I'm okay with that." For the first time in his life, James felt truly free as he ended the call, even as the enormity of his decision sank in. When James told Ellie what had happened, she stared at him in disbelief. "You gave up everything for this?" "It wasn't everything," James replied. "Not anymore." Ellie shook her head, a mixture of frustration and gratitude in her expression. "You're insane." "Maybe," James admitted, "but it's worth it. You're worth it." The words hung in the air, charged with an unspoken intensity. Ellie looked away, her cheeks flushed, but James could see the faint smile tugging at her lips. The fallout from James's decision was swift. Within days, news spread that he had severed ties with his father. Some people in town were skeptical, others surprised, but Ellie saw the change in James firsthand. He threw himself into the farm, working tirelessly alongside her and learning the intricacies of its operations. One afternoon, as they repaired a broken irrigation line, Ellie glanced at James. "So, what's the plan now?" "We fight," James said simply, wiping sweat from his brow. "We show the bank that this farm isn't going anywhere." "And if that doesn't work?" Ellie asked. James met her gaze, his expression resolute. "Then we figure something else out. But I'm not giving up." Ellie nodded, a flicker of hope returning to her eyes. For the first time, she began to believe that they might actually win. The final battle came in the form of a meeting with the bank. James and Ellie sat across from a panel of stern-faced executives, armed with financial records, community testimonials, and a detailed plan to make the farm profitable again. James spoke with a confidence he hadn't known he possessed, drawing on skills he'd spent years ignoring. "This farm isn't just a piece of land," James said, his voice steady. "It's a cornerstone of this community. Taking it away would hurt not just Ellie but the people who depend on her." Ellie chimed in, her voice filled with emotion. "My family has poured everything into this farm for generations. We're not asking for a handout, we're asking for the chance to prove ourselves." The executives exchanged glances, murmuring quietly among themselves. Finally, the lead banker nodded. "We'll give you 6 months to make good on your proposal. If you can meet the outlined goals, the farm stays yours." Ellie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you." As they left the meeting, Ellie turned to James, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I can't believe we did it." "You did it," James corrected. "I just gave you a little help." Ellie laughed, shaking her head. "A little? You put everything on the line for this." James grinned. "Well, what can I say? I'm a sucker for a good cause." Ellie's expression softened, and for the first time, she reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, James. For everything." He squeezed back, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the summer sun. For the first time in his life, James felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The weeks following the bank meeting were a blur of relentless work and cautious optimism. The 6-month timeline loomed over Ellie and James like a ticking clock, but it also fueled their determination. Every day was filled with tasks aimed at transforming the farm into a sustainable operation. Ellie handled the logistics, negotiating with local markets and suppliers, while James took on the physical labor with a tenacity that surprised even him. The once awkward city boy now worked alongside Ellie with confidence, repairing machinery, planting new crops, and tending to the animals with a sense of purpose. One evening, as they finished stacking hay bales in the barn, Ellie leaned against a beam and surveyed their progress. "I have to admit," she said, her voice tinged with humor, "I didn't think you'd last a week out here." James chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. "Neither did I. But it turns out, I'm more capable than I thought." Ellie smiled, her eyes softening. "You've done more than I could have ever asked for. I don't know how I would have managed without you." James looked at her, his grin fading into something more serious. "You could have done it. You've always been stronger than you give yourself credit for." Ellie glanced away, her cheeks coloring slightly. "Maybe. But it's been nice not having to do it alone." As the farm began to flourish, so did the bond between James and Ellie. They fell into an easy rhythm, their banter light and their silences comfortable. James found himself looking forward to the quiet moments they shared after a long day, sitting on the porch and watching the sun set over the fields. One such evening, Ellie turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Why did you really stay?" she asked, breaking the silence. James hesitated, then said, "At first, it was about proving something to my father. But somewhere along the way, it became about you. This farm, this town, you made me see what I was missing." Ellie's gaze lingered on him, her green eyes shimmering in the fading light. "You've changed, James. More than I ever thought possible." He smiled, a warmth spreading through him at her words. "That's because of you, Ellie. You showed me what it means to care about something real." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the unspoken emotions hanging in the air between them. Then Ellie reached out and took his hand, her touch grounding him in a way he hadn't known he needed. As the 6-month deadline approached, the community rallied around the farm. James and Ellie's efforts inspired their neighbors to pitch in, offering resources, advice, and even labor. The farm became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of determination and unity. When the bank's representatives returned for an inspection, they were visibly impressed. The farm's profits had increased, the infrastructure was stronger than ever, and the support from the community was undeniable. After reviewing the records and walking the fields, the lead banker extended his hand to Ellie. "Congratulations," he said. "You've met the requirements. The farm is officially yours." Ellie stared at him, disbelief and relief washing over her in equal measure. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. James stood beside her, his own relief evident in the proud smile he gave her. "You did it," he said quietly. Ellie turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We did it." That night, the town gathered at the farm to celebrate. Strings of lights illuminated the barn, and the air was filled with laughter, music, and the scent of freshly baked pies. Ellie stood at the center of it all, her joy infectious as she thanked everyone who had supported her. James watched from the sidelines, a glass of cider in hand. For the first time in his life, he felt truly content, not because of wealth or status, but because he had found a sense of belonging he hadn't known was possible. Ellie approached him, her smile radiant. "Why are you hiding over here?" she teased. "I was just admiring your victory speech," James replied, grinning. "You've got quite the way with words." Ellie rolled her eyes but laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Come on," she said, grabbing his hand. "This celebration is for both of us." James let her lead him into the crowd, his heart full in a way he hadn't thought possible just months ago. As the night wound down, Ellie and James found themselves alone on the porch, the sounds of the party fading into the background. Ellie leaned against the railing, her gaze fixed on the stars. "You're staying, right?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a note of vulnerability. James moved closer, his hand brushing against hers. "If you'll have me." Ellie turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "I think I'd like that." In the quiet of the night, beneath the wide expanse of sky, James felt something shift, a sense of permanence, of home. He had found what he'd been searching for all along, not in the cities or the wealth he'd once clung to, but here, with Ellie. The morning sun broke over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the farm. The fields swayed gently in the breeze, and the distant hum of birds added a peaceful rhythm to the day. James stood by the barn, leaning on a rake as he watched Ellie emerge from the house with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "You've got that look again," Ellie said, handing him a mug. "What look?" James asked, grinning as he took a sip. "Like you're actually happy to be here," Ellie teased, though her tone was warm. James chuckled. "Maybe because I am." Ellie shook her head, a smile tugging at her lips. "Never thought I'd see the day." James Thornton, a farmhand. "Not just a farmhand," James corrected, his grin widening. "A co-owner." Ellie raised an eyebrow, her playful expression softening into something more serious. "You're really staying?" "I told you I would," James replied. "This place, it's not just a farm anymore. It's home." Ellie's gaze softened, and she nodded. "Good. Because I can't imagine running it without you." Over the next few weeks, James and Ellie settled into their new rhythm. With the farm's future secure, they began working on plans to expand, honoring Ellie's late mother's vision. They planted new crops, repaired old equipment, and even started hosting workshops for the community, teaching sustainable farming techniques. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the fields, Ellie paused, wiping her brow. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but you're pretty good at this whole farming thing." James smirked. "I had a great teacher." Ellie rolled her eyes but laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Don't let it go to your head." "Too late," James quipped, earning a playful shove from Ellie. The transformation in James was evident to everyone who visited the farm. The once spoiled heir now moved with purpose and ease, his hands calloused from hard work and his heart firmly rooted in the land he'd once dismissed as beneath him. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ellie turned to James with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever miss it? The city, the money, all the things you gave up?" James considered her question, then shook his head. "Not really. For a long time, I thought that life was everything. But it was empty, just noise and distractions. Here, everything feels real. The work, the people, you." Ellie smiled, her eyes glistening in the fading light. "You've changed so much." "So have you," James said. "You let me in. That's no small thing." Ellie laughed softly, then leaned her head against his shoulder. "I guess we're both a little stubborn." James rested his cheek against her hair, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "Yeah, but I think it worked out okay." Months later, the farm hosted its first community event under its new banner, Carter Thornton Farms. The sign above the barn gleamed in the sunlight, a testament to the partnership that had saved the land. Families gathered for the festival, laughing and sharing stories, while Ellie and James moved through the crowd, greeting guests and ensuring everything ran smoothly. It was a celebration of resilience and new beginnings, and the energy was infectious. As the day wound down, James found Ellie by the edge of the fields, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He joined her, slipping his hand into hers. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Ellie smiled, her gaze still on the horizon. "About how far we've come. How much we've built together." James squeezed her hand, his voice soft. "And how much more we'll build." Ellie turned to him, her green eyes bright with hope. "Together." As the sun disappeared and the stars began to emerge, James pulled her into a gentle embrace. The farm stretched out around them, a living, breathing symbol of the life they had chosen to create, not just for themselves, but for the generations that would follow. And for the first time in his life, James knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.